Hello everybody. Welcome to Rebel History, where we look into falsified history, the chronology, and a little bit of Tartaria. Today we are going to look into Joseph Justus Scaliger, the father of chronology, or the bottleneck of history. This will be considered the keystone of the chronology, both to the old chronology as to the new chronology. I haven't fully formed my conclusions yet regarding this individual, as this seems to be a very complicated subject, and I am still trying to look at this from different angles and perspectives. And just studying this individual alone could probably take a lifetime. So this three-part episode functions as a mere introduction to the individual known as Joseph Justus Scaliger and the context which surrounds him. Now, what many people don't know is that most, if not all, chronology of the ancient and medieval history in its present form was edited or created in a series of fundamental works in the 16th and 17th century that began with the writings of Joseph Justus Scaliger, also called the founder of modern chronology as a science. This work was then continued by his fellow scholar, the Jesuit Denis Petau, also called Dionysius Petavius. Our current historical narrative today is still based on the work and interpretation of these two scholars. Joseph Scaliger was a Calvinist religious leader and a scholar, a self-proclaimed member of the House of Della Scala, one of the ruling families of Verona. He was the son of Italian physician and philosopher Julius Caesar Scaliger, which coincidentally is a very interesting name. In 1562, he converted to Protestantism, and what I personally found very interesting was the connection between Scaliger and Hugo Grotius, also known as Hugo de Groot, a key actor in Dutch history but also regarded as the father of international law. After the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, Scaliger fled to Geneva with fellow Huguenots, where he was appointed as professor at the Academy of Geneva, which was founded by John Calvin in 1559. In 1593, Scaliger accepted a position at the University of Leiden, where he remained until the end of his life. The University of Leiden was founded in 1575 during the Dutch revolt against Habsburg Spain by William of Orange. At the time, it was known for its religious and intellectual tolerance, or at least this is how it is presented. Joseph Scaliger is responsible for reconstructing the lost Chronicle of Eusebius, who I consider a keystone figure in the historical narrative. Together with Saint Jerome, Eusebius is considered to have laid the foundation for chronology, as the Chronicon is considered to be the first systematic attempt to synchronize the various histories of the ancient civilizations into a single timeline, and thus is fundamental in the establishment of our current historical narrative. The Chronicon deals with the era starting from Abraham in 216 BC up until Constantine the Great in 325 AD, a solid 2000 years. Right. Eusebius is considered the father of church history and the first to write a comprehensive history of the early church period. This work is called the Church History, or the Ecclesiastical History, and deals with the first 300 years of our current timeline from the Apostolic Age up until Constantine the Great. The original Greek Chronicon of Eusebius did not reach our time and did not reach Joseph Scaliger as well, so Scaliger had to mainly reconstruct the Chronicon from the Latin translations of Saint Jerome. The Armenian translation of the Chronicon was also unavailable to Scaliger, as this was discovered relatively late in 1782, almost 200 years after the establishment of Scaliger chronology. Joseph Scaliger printed his reconstruction of the Chronicon in his Thesaurus Temporum, in which Scaliger collected, restored, and arranged every chronological relic in existence in Greek or Latin. Professor Elias Bickerman states the following about this. Although Joseph Scaliger, the founding father of modern chronology as a science, had attempted to reconstruct the entire tractate of Eusebius, the datings of Eusebius that often got transcribed erroneously in manuscripts are hardly of any use to us nowadays. This implies if the dating was done erroneously, not only could all the events before Christ be misdated, but also the events described by Eusebius in his church history may not have happened in the era from the 1st to the 4th century AD, but in a different era. Before Scaliger, most attempts to date the events of ancient history relied on the Bible. Biblical events were tied and synchronized with secular events. Scaliger assembled a timeline that included Egyptian and Babylonian history. He also applied astronomy, as the many eclipses are mentioned in ancient records. Scaliger was the first to claim that the early Egyptian dynasties and Babylonian kingdoms existed before the accepted biblical date of the flood. I am not sure if he used any carbon dating in this assessment or if he used a telescope in his astronomical analysis, as the earliest patent for the telescope stems from 1608, and the earliest application of radiocarbon dating was in 1946 due to the development of former Manhattan Project scientist and professor Willard Libby. The discipline of paleography would also take another 100 years until it was established by Jean Mabillon and Bernard de Montfaucon in 1681 and 1708, so I am not sure if Scaliger had the help of expert paleographers. There are also some issues in regards to the mathematical capabilities of Scaliger, as he claimed to have squared the circle, which is a problem in geometry first proposed by Greek mathematicians, a task which was proven to be impossible, and even though the most prominent mathematicians of the era tried to convey to Scaliger that his reasoning was incorrect, they were only met with insults. So let's imagine how Scaliger would have reacted to critique to his chronology. It would be accurate to call the modern consensual chronology of the classical and medieval period the Scaliger-Petavius version. In principle, this can be considered the entire chronology prior to the 14th century. Even though, currently, this version is considered the established historical narrative, in the 17th and 18th century, this was not the only version of history, and its veracity had been questioned by various scholars, including Sir Isaac Newton, who had created his own chronology. Other criticism was raised from the Academy of Scriptures and Fine Arts, which hosted an extensive discussion in the early 18th century regarding the veracity of the entire Roman tradition. The starting point was an essay by Levesque de Pouilly, in where he cast doubt on the reliability of the entire heritage of the historical Greco-Roman narrative. These discussions continued for many years, and the accumulated materials provided the basis for the in-depth criticism of the 19th century. For example, Robert Baldauf, who studied classical philology at the University of Basel with his History and its Criticism, makes the case that not only is ancient history a forgery of the Renaissance era, but the early Middle Ages are a forgery as well. Also keep episode 2 in mind, where we looked into Heribert Illig and his 300 Phantom Years. Heribert Illig also wrote a book with Gunnar Heinzson, where they question the veracity of the Scaliger chronology and the entire Egyptian timeline. Robert Baldauf had studied the archives of the famous monastery of St. Gallen, formerly one of the key centers of Catholicism, and discovered traces of a library raid made by Bocchio Braccolini and an associate of his. According to Baldauf, some of the medieval chronicles ascribed to different authors resembled each other to such an extent that Baldauf was forced to identify them as the works of the same author, despite the fact that these documents were allegedly separated by an interval of 2 centuries at least. In the 19th century, the two prominent historians, Polydore Hoccart and John Wilson Ross, published the results of their research, where they made the case that the famous works Histories and the Annals by Cornelius Tacitus were in actuality written by the same well-known Bocchio Braccolini. Wilhelm Kammeier, who in 1926 wrote The Universal Falsification of History, claimed that nearly all of the ancient and early medieval Western documents to have either been copies or forgeries from a much more recent age. Professor Otto Neugebauer wrote that the major part of the manuscripts on which our knowledge of the Greek sciences are based upon consists of Byzantine copies made 500 to 1500 years after the death of their authors. The English historian Edwin Johnson states the following: "We are a lot closer in time to the Greeks and the Romans than what the chronological tables tell us." Edwin Johnson called for a revision of the entire edifice of the ancient and medieval chronology. Professor Theodore Mommsen, who pointed out many discrepancies in Scaliger chronology, makes the following comments in regards to Roman history. In what concerns the global chronology, everything was a lot worse. The development of the historical science gave hope for traditional history to be verified by documents and other dependable sources. But the hope was buried in complete frustration. The more research was conducted and the deeper it went, the more obvious the difficulties in writing a critical history of Rome became. Mommsen was an important representative of the scientific current at the time, which was later dubbed as hypercriticism. Jean Hardoux, who was a contemporary of Newton, a member of the Jesuit order, a professor of theology, and the director of the French Royal Library, claimed that the work of many ancient authors were written hundreds of years later than whatever was implied by the consensual datings of their lifetimes. In other words, he claimed to have exposed the works in question as forgeries. One of Hardoux's final conclusions had been that nearly all of the ancient classical texts date from the 14th century at the earliest. He believed a group of 14th century monks had forged not only the core classical texts, but also a range of later references to these texts, thereby creating a vast web of mutually reinforcing deception. The goals of this group was supposedly to establish atheism amongst men by paganizing the facts of Christianity. He also mentioned the falsification of nearly all of the ancient coins, works of art, stone carvings, and in particular, the documents of all ecumenical councils that had preceded the Council of Trent. Most of Hardoux's work was banned and put on the index of forbidden books. I guess this does sound somewhat familiar. The general observation of conventional history is that the entire bulk of the classical ancient material only surfaced during the Renaissance. It was rediscovered, as the narrative states. In most cases, a detailed looking into it shows us that there is a lot of obscurity regarding the classical material's origin. And the lack of documentation during the passage through the so-called Dark Ages leads one to suspect that none of this material had really existed before the dawn of the Renaissance. In principle, Scaliger Batavius can be considered a bottleneck of the historical narrative, as even today we are basing our understanding of the historical narrative on this work.